hanging around. Kids got alligator blood.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 6th podcast. I'm your host in the machine, Pablo Petrucci. I'm going to give you an audio review of OJ Made in America just because that documentary is so fucking awesome. It's so fucking awesome. I don't know, but before I do, can I just talk about how much I love the New York accent? My sister went to New York recently for a wedding. And she was telling me, because I'm Canadian, so whenever we hear a New York accent, I don't know. It's just like you feel there's something cool about it. There's something. It's like cinematic because you associate like Goodfellas or some sort of Scorsese movie. You know what I mean? Everybody sounds like a gangster. It's like. Yeah, I was listening to an interview with a guy named Chris Weidman. I don't know if you know him, but he's a UFC fighter from Long Island, and he's like, this is the way he talks. Is funny. He's like, this is what he says. It's kind of crazy. He is the champion, and when you look at the rankings, the number one contender is Luke, who you just beat. Who is the closest guy to you that you haven't fought yet? That's right. That would be me, and that would be a no-brainer. But this guy, he's just trying to win another fight. He's so shocked that he's the champion that he's trying to give himself a chance to hold on to that belt a little while longer. So he picks Henderson because he thinks it'll be an easy win. I heard that he was doing some interview and was actually answering questions about a fantasy fight with Conor McGregor and talking trash. Listen, if somebody was asking me about a fight with Conor, I wouldn't even entertain the question, hypothetical or not. That's just something that would never happen. He went up to 170 pounds and we all saw that didn't work out for him. He's a 145 pounder. I would never talk about breaking his neck or whatever it was he said. I'd feel like a bully talking like that about a 145 pound guy. Isn't it amazing? I mean, all I did was read out something Chris Weidman just said. And it just sounds like I'm in a New York gangster movie. You gotta give it to New Yorkers for their accent. Same with English people. Whenever you hear that accent, to North American ears, there's just something about it that takes you to the movies because usually that's where you're hearing it. So anyway, that's just me. I'm obviously diverting a little or digressing from the real topic, which is kind of a little more serious and not as funny as there's a cool New York accent, but watching OJ Made in America, which is a 5-part documentary series that I think ESPN showed. And so I'm going to give you guys a bit of a review. It's hard not to give you a review about this because it's just so good. I was really surprised. For those of you who know me, I'm very skeptical, rightfully so, highly skeptical of anything portrayed in the mainstream media. That includes ESPN. Like I wouldn't think of ESPN as like the standard bearer in journalism or documentary style journalism. Or journalism style documentary, whatever, however you want to call it. But I have to say the OJ Made in America 5-part series was really well done. And it captured because on the one hand, it captured the various nuances and complexities. There are just so many things intersect when it comes to the OJ trial. And I found myself even yesterday talking about the documentary with my brother-in-law, and I just couldn't stop myself because when you talk about one aspect of the OJ trial, or not even the OJ trial, but like when you talk about one aspect of the documentary, let's say the trial, which is only one part of the documentary, it's the documentary. It's a lot like a Russian doll, but like an infinite Russian doll, where you're a Russian doll that is the, you know, those things where you open up the Russian doll and there's a smaller one inside, and then you open up that one, there's a smaller one, you keep doing it, it just gets smaller. Like there's so many things that are interconnected, and you can't stop. It was a lot like that. So you talk about the trial, and then you're going to talk about Johnny Cochran. You talk about Johnny Cochran, you'll talk about um, you'll end up talking about class, or at least that's how I thought of it. Because Johnny Cochran, for as sleazy as he was in that trial, he's sort of like I consider him like even though he uses and implements so many dirty tactics, he's such a master at it. So you're looking at like an all-star lawyer, and that's sort of what money can buy you. So you end up talking about class, and then you talk about class, and you talk about race. You talk about race, and then you talk about politics. You talk about politics, you talk about history, the LAPD, corruption, civil rights in the United States, and so on. And you can just see how it just one thing bleeds into the next. Uh, that's partly what makes this documentary, I think, worth watching, and why I'm going to say I highly recommend it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. Just find whatever way you can to watch it. It's just so fascinating, and I found myself. This is how good the documentary is. Now, there's only one thing that will ever get me to yell at a screen, and that's usually a sporting match. Like if I'm watching a soccer game or a UFC, they're the only two things that seem to grab my attention. And in both those scenarios, in a sporting match, I'll yell and I'll just scream. I'll be like, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you, you say stupid stuff." I can't help it. Just the way that I am. Also, get really animated when I'm watching a sport of some kind that I'm passionate about, but particularly soccer, and then the UFC, mixed martial arts. Um, OJ Made in America is the only time where I was watching a documentary and I was yelling at the screen, just swearing and stuff, like almost like no better than a hooligan. I was just yelling out. It has, the documentary taps into some of the such core issues that hit so deep that you can't help but, or at least I couldn't help but get super animated about it. And I think partly it's just the ingredients of the documentary itself. The content is so powerful and engaging that in it sets it by its own accord, it elicits that kind of response in me. But also it has to it's a result of the talent of the filmmaker. I think his name is Edelman, is his last name. And I think it's well done in that sense too, that they have a way of juxtaposing one segment with another, or one clip with another, so as to really get you engaged. And I just couldn't help it. I was getting super animated about it. But it really is a nuanced take on race, politics, and celebrity, and so many things. It just covers so many things. Now, the only now part of the nuanced take is because what you're getting in OJ Made in America is, it's not just this. One of the reasons I didn't want to watch it in the first place was because usually America loves their rags to riches stories, and then like there's a trope of rags to riches, and then they lose everything in the end. And for the most part, I would say the documentary veered away from that. It was really a look at an individual, a clearly a deeply troubled and narcissistic individual named OJ Simpson, who also happens to be an extraordinary athlete, who also happens to be black, and becomes successful in the late 60s. I think it's 68 that he really begins to become known as a football hero in college, a college football hero at USC, which is the University of Southern California. And they kind of do a good job of staying out of the trope of rags to riches and then the decline, although in a sense that is what OJ Simpson's life is, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, there's so many other factors. So to contrast OJ's life with what's going on politically and socially in the United States and what's going on in California, particularly, where you see footage of the police brutalizing so many African Americans, and it's really troubling to watch because you see the rise of this extraordinary athlete and the contrast between his rise and what's going on, what the ordinary African American has to experience on a regular basis, the constant oppression sanctioned by elements of the establishment like the police. Just that contrast alone is really powerful, and that juxtaposition continues throughout the documentary. So this rise and fall is going on within a background context that's constantly bleeding into not only OJ's life and his decisions, and I should, obviously he's a killer, obviously he's the murderer. I mean, that's one thing you also can't help but take away. I mean, the evidence is just so overwhelmingly against OJ in that trial. But the documentary is excellent in showing you all the factors that go into why he ends up becoming innocent in the trial, why the jury chooses that verdict. And then it doesn't end there. That's another thing I think that the documentary does well, is they decided, let's not just make this about the trial. Let's make this about sort of the entire trajectory and his life after the trial and what happened as a result, sort of the aftermath. And the aftermath is just as interesting as the trial itself. And also OJ Simpson's rise to success is also just as interesting. Those were the things I was surprised with, because I found him to be a relatively uninteresting person. I just thought, well, obviously he's just a narcissistic, either a psychopath or sociopath. There's something clearly wrong in a human being for them to commit a murder of that magnitude. Such violence and hatred and rage. There's definitely something off there, to put it very mildly. The only thing I think this documentary gets wrong is that they conclude that it's a tragedy. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the definition of a tragedy is that the definition is generally in the humanities and English lit and so on, is that for a story to be a tragedy, there has to be essentially something good in the person, in the hero or in the protagonist. There has to be genuine good characteristics in this human being. But through some form of hubris, some sort of character flaw, this leads them inevitably to their own downfall and ruin, and to the ruin of those around them. So the classic tragedy is Macbeth, where Macbeth, in the beginning, what you see is heroic characteristics, somebody who has courage and bravery, and really doesn't have, is not really an evil or malicious person, but you see these ingredients of insecurity and ego and pride that can be turned into something murderous, which is what ends up happening. So there's an essential good there of courage and heroism that's lost through hubris. So by the end, it's just, like any Shakespearean tragedy, it starts out with some sort of good characteristics, and then it ends in a bloodbath. The reason, and so at the end of OJ Made in America, that's sort of what they conclude with, that there's this, that OJ is somebody with essential good and that he's a tragedy. Even OJ says that about himself. They have a clip of OJ talking while he's in custody in 1994. He says, I don't know what happened to me. I used to be, there was good in me, and now, I look inside and I'm just empty. I don't buy that. I think that's the only thing I think that they got wrong. in the documentary, which was, I think for it, I don't think there's anything really good in OJ to begin with. I believe that OJ was a narcissist from day one. I think you can see it in the documentary that there isn't really essential good in the guy. He's selfish from day one, and like I mean, I see other people saying that there's good in him, and I see OJ saying that about himself, that there's good in him. That's a consistent thing. A lot of his friends say, I can't believe that he could do it, and some of them maintain to this day that he's innocent. But the only consistency in his character is that you see from the beginning to end in OJ was always finding himself in a situation, and he would survey that situation by figuring out how to maximize it to his personal benefit. He does it time and time again at every major transition of his life. So when he starts out as a Heisman Trophy winner, he's basically what's the word? Recruited to USC for his skills as a footballer, which is, I think it's called a running back. He's just extraordinary as a runner and as an athlete. And so right away, there's this backdrop of civil unrest amongst the African American community. They're being degraded regularly and treated like second-class citizens and being brutalized, often by the police. And they're treated as if their lives don't matter, that crimes can be committed to African Americans and no consequences will result. Now, in this extraordinary political backdrop, you get a guy like OJ Simpson, who from day one, in his early days, already would say behind the scenes that he's not black. And when people would talk to him as if he was, just black in a way, he would say, I'm not black, I'm OJ. And I don't think he did that. He would sell it to you as if he's doing it for the right reasons. He would say it like, look, I want to be judged for what I do, not for my skin color, which if he was saying the truth would be commendable in a sense, or it's understandable that somebody would say, look, don't reduce me to a skin color. I want to be judged by my merits, my characteristics, which is I have talent, I work hard, and I push myself to be an extraordinary athlete. That's understandable. I don't think that's why OJ does it. I think from day one, he's just surveying the landscape and he's thinking, what's good for OJ? What's good for me? And what's good for OJ is to not involve himself in racial politics, because he knows that he'll become less popular if he gets involved. So what he does is he just says, and almost like he's almost saying, I don't have a dog in this fight. This isn't about me. And in a way, he essentially abandons, people that need a voice. They need somebody to speak up for them, because the press and the mainstream media, especially in the 60s, but it continues to this day, it continually tries to sanitize what's really going on. So it's absolutely critical that someone like OJ Simpson, who has a platform to be able to draw attention to the issue. And a lot of other athletes, that's what they were doing, like Muhammad Ali gets a lot of respect for that very reason. And OJ is sort of notable for never actually getting involved. There's a kind of really startling silence about him from day one, and it's almost palpable when you watch the early footage in the documentary of what he was like in his college years. So already you're seeing a guy surveying the situation, figuring out right away, well, how's this going to benefit me? How do I escape? How do I get out of this unscathed? And that's what he does. And what's ironic is that it works for him. It works. And he translates that kind of thinking into his career. And it's the same with when he gets into the Buffalo Bills. He sort of stays quiet, he's actually not very good in this first couple of years, and the next thing you know, the right coach comes along that brings out his best characteristics, and he becomes sort of like a footballing hero. But the entire time he's a success in the Buffalo Bills, he never discusses race, he never addresses it. It's as if it doesn't exist. And what's interesting is what the documentary does really well is it's showing the contrast between the political reality that African Americans face in the United States and the silence and success of OJ Simpson. That contrast, it's very effective in giving you a bigger picture of what's actually going on and how his silence really benefited OJ and didn't really benefit a lot of other people, particularly African Americans. So at every stage, he's doing that. At every stage, he's figuring out how it's going to benefit him. And it really made me think OJ's life. So he does that at the trial. First, he lies to people after the murder of Nicole and Ronald Goldman. He lies to people about what really went down immediately after, when people had suspected him. He sort of pretends like he's innocent. Then he does all of these things to show that he looks like a guy who is admitting guilt. Like, first he's supposed to have this big press conference, and at the last minute he leaves. And at the last minute he leaves, he doesn't show up. And sort of the police and the media kind of thought, I think we got him. We've got a guy who's about to admit what he did. And that alone ought to tell you something about a man and his conscience. But the other thing, too, is by jumping into the Bronco and holding his friend at gunpoint while he's driving, that's another sign of admitting guilt, of somebody who's trying to run away. And even the things he's saying is... the things that he says at that point in his life sounds like a guy who's guilty. But again, I don't think he's doing it because he has a conscience in the way that most people think of having a conscience. Like most of us, when we feel horrible or terrible, we break down or we cry or we feel ashamed or we feel guilty. I don't think OJ feels that at that point. I think he's just like he does in his past, and what he does at that point is he's surveying the landscape and he's figuring out what will be the best for me. And that's very different than doing the right thing for its own sake because you believe it's the right thing and your conscience compels you to do it. That's different. You know what I mean? That's one way of doing it. But there's another thing is when you're doing the right thing, but really you're just doing it because you figure this is going to give me the best opportunity. Maybe if I sell myself to the public as I'm a victim here and I made the wrong choice, which is an absurd thing to do given the atrocity of the crime. But I think what he's doing again there is he's saying, well, if pretending that I'm a victim here, even though I did the wrong thing, yes, I committed a crime and I'm sorry and I'm going to repent. I think he's just figuring out, he's just thinking, maybe that's the best thing I can do in this scenario. And again, the documentary is really good at showing you all these things. There's an extraordinary amount of, it's a lot of showing and not telling, basically. Not to say that there isn't an authorial voice in it. Of course there is. But what's interesting again is that OJ goes from like talking like a guy who's about to confess, and then suddenly what's interesting in the documentary, you see it, is he starts to figure out that he might have a chance. He might have a chance in going to trial and winning. And when you see him figuring that out, he suddenly begins to change the way he talks. So for a brief moment, when he's in that Bronco with the gun pointed to his friend's head, he sounds like a guy about to admit what he did. And then immediately figures out soon after that that he might have a chance in winning. And then all of a sudden his demeanor changes, the way he talks in front of people when the camera's on him is suddenly very different. And it's again another example of O.J. Simpson surveying the landscape, realizing what his avenue is for escape, and moving forward confidently and accordingly in order to benefit himself and only himself. It's extraordinary. And this continues even after, in the aftermath of the trial. He's doing the same thing. So on the surface, it looks like his life is changing, that he's making different decisions, he's hanging around with different people. But I think all of that is appearance related. The truth is he remains OJ from the beginning to the end. And that is this, psychopathic, jealous, possessive, extraordinarily and extremely competitive competitive is almost an understatement with that guy. And this jealous, murderous, man with severe rage problems, and in complete denial of who he is, and completely narcissistic. I think that doesn't change. I think that's the constant, and all that changes is the circumstances that enable him to reveal his true self. And even in the aftermath, he's doing the same things. He's trying to figure out how does this scenario benefit me, and how do I adapt and secure secure the most for myself and only myself. And if you watch the documentary, all 5 parts, I'm confident you'll see that. And what's interesting to me is the trajectory of OJ Simpson, this sort of celebrity and murderer. What's interesting about his life is, and his performances as an athlete, makes one of the things that I've always found fascinating about sport is the relationship between how an athlete performs in their particular sport and their personality sort of off the field. There's a Lionel Messi anecdote. For those of you who don't know who Lionel Messi is, well, it'd be crazy if you didn't know him, but it's understandable in North America because he's the world's biggest star in soccer. And he's Argentinian, so I know a lot about him. And there's a guy named Javier Mascherano, pronounced properly. Javier Mascherano has been Lionel Messi's teammate for about close to 10 years now. They've been playing together at the national team level. They play for Argentina, and they played together on Barcelona for a bit less than 10 years. But they've been playing together and have been teammates and friends for a very long time. They even live close to each other in the same neighborhood. And Javier Mascherano said about Lionel Messi, who's arguably the greatest there's ever been in soccer. He said about Lionel Messi, he said, what's interesting about Messi is he's just as unpredictable off the field as he is on the field. That you can never predict what he's going to say. That really, like a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, isn't it interesting that a guy's personality off the field, in a sense, is reflected on field as well? That if you have a character trait, it reveals itself even in the sport, which is, in a sense, what could be more obvious? But in a way, you think, how could that be? Because in the sport, you have to follow the rules of the sport, and in a sense, you have to do it independently of who you are. But I think, psychology would tell you that in a way you can't separate the two. And I think what you see with OJ Simpson on the field is what he's like even in his personal life. He's always, if you watch footage of him as a running back, what he does in his personal life of surveying the situation, figuring out how am I going to get out of this, is exactly what he's like on the field. You see it from second to second, moment to moment. OJ Simpson reads the circumstances, sees the positioning of every athlete, and he's figuring out where his opening is. How do I get what's good for me and OJ, given that all these people are after me? It's really uncanny when you think about it, that that there's a deeper relationship there between the performance and how he's expressing himself as an athlete and what he's like in his personal life. Which is partly why I'm so convinced that this isn't really a tragedy, that this is a guy who's from day one just looking out for number one. It's a really interesting phenomenon, I think. And So it's like I said, I can't recommend the documentary enough. And I would really be happy if people watch the movie after listening to this, or watch the documentary after listening to this, and let me know what you think. But again, I will say that it's an excellent documentary. But I think the only thing I think they got a little bit wrong is that it's not truly a tragedy in the technical sense. It's there's no essential good there. I don't see it. I see a performance of somebody pretending to be good, but is really someone who is from day one looking out for himself, and he never fails. Even when Nicole Brown is just absolutely just slaughtered, and so is Ron Goldman. I mean, it's tragic. It's utterly tragic. And just even in the aftermath, the way he's constantly talking about himself and talking about himself as a victim. You never really hear him talk about his kids or how hard it was for his kids. You just don't see that. You just see a guy constantly obsessing about himself. And that to me is a very strong sign of a narcissist. That in this bloodbath and this tragedy, he's never once thinking about Nicole and poor Nicole and how she didn't deserve it. You never hear him say that. And you never once hear him say how bad he feels for his children, that they're victims in all of this. You never hear him say that. He's constantly talking about how everyone has failed him, which is a very odd thing. So anyway, if you get the chance, I definitely recommend it, and would love to hear your feedback.